Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us on our discussion today on key biodiversity areas in British Columbia. My name is Ian Adams. I am the Provincial Coordinator with Wildlife Conservation Society of Canada for KBAs in British Columbia. I'm talking today from Cranbrook in the southeast corner in Amakas-Tinaka, traditional unceded territory of the Tinaka Nation. Our first speaker today is Kara Rautza-Perrin, who's the director of the KBA program with Conservation Society of Canada. She was the lead author of the National KBA Standards and heads up the KBA Secretariat. She'll be providing us an overview of the KBA program in Canada, its structures and objectives. Kara.
Thanks so much, Ian. So thank you all for being with us. We know that we've been doing this work for a little while in British Columbia, and it's long and meticulous and quite challenging work. So we're really happy to have so many of you who've been participating for a long time. So I'm going to just start us off with a really quick overview. I think many people now know what key biodiversity areas are. You can go to the next slide. So the formal definition of a key biodiversity area is a site that contributes significantly to the persistence of biodiversity. And that's a very specific thing. So we do get lots of letters all the time about, you know, what is the area that's really special to me, a key biodiversity area. And we don't know unless we actually do an investigation, but a key biodiversity area is a very specific thing. So if you go to the next slide, it has to meet one of several criteria that is laid out in the Global Key Biodiversity Area Standard. And now we also have a National Key Biodiversity Area Standard as well for Canada that we'll mention in a minute. But basically, in order to be a key biodiversity area, you need to meet one of the following criteria. So Criterion A, for example, is threatened biodiversity, and that includes species at risk in very specific categories. So you can use different threat assessment types in order to identify which are the species that might even qualify a site as a key biodiversity area. Also threatened ecosystems as well, so that's red listed ecosystems. You can identify a key biodiversity area for geographically restricted biodiversity, again, species and ecosystems. So these would usually be rare species or ecosystems that only occur in small patches across Canada. Criterion C is areas with the highest ecological integrity within an ecoregion. So in Canada, this is work that you'll hear about in a minute from our ecosystem criteria coordinator, Lucy Poli, but it's very interesting work, and we're likely to identify some very large sites, mostly in the north of Canada, for the highest ecological integrity. Criterion D is sites where aggregations occur, so where species might gather at particular times in their life cycles. So migratory staging areas or caribou calving areas, polar bear denning areas, potentially, if they're aggregated enough. We're still investigating that. And then Criterion E is one that we're not really working on too much. It's identifying all the sites using, in a quantitative way, using irreplaceability analyses. And so far, there's no evidence that we'll find additional sites that we're not already capturing with the other criteria, but we'll see as we go and as the methodology for that criterion develops. One thing that I should mention is that the key biodiversity areas are relatively new. So even though now we're a couple of years in, the standard was only published in 2016, and Canada is still at the forefront of a lot of work to know how to identify key biodiversity areas in diverse landscapes using multiple criteria for different taxonomic groups and different ecosystems. You can go to the next slide. So this is just, these are the two standards that we use. These are the Bibles of key biodiversity area work. If you're not sure whether a site meets key biodiversity area standard criteria, you can look it up in the global standard for the identification of key biodiversity areas, as well as this new national standard, which was published in Canada earlier this year. We've also just released the French translation. And what it does is it expands our ability to make sure that we're capturing Canadian conservation priorities using this tool. So, for example, before we could only use globally threatened species as sort of a trigger for a key biodiversity area, but the national standard allows us to use COSEWIC threatened species as well in the endangered and threatened categories. That's just one example of how we're expanding it. It's quite a conservative expansion. Dave Fraser was one of the architects trying to figure out how to do this expansion or this adaptation of the global standard to make it as relevant as possible in Canada. It was reviewed by governments, NGOs, all sorts of stakeholders, scientists. So now it's set. We assume that it may shift a little bit as time proceeds, but we're pretty happy with that product. We can move on. So KBAs are meant to be a tool for conservation, but also land use management. It's very important to note, and we note it often, that it's an information layer. There is no management prescription that comes with it. There's no impact on access to land. And the reason for this is that we're working at a national scale to, using a regional approach, of course, to, as fast as we can, identify all these areas that meet the criteria that are delineated with a strong rationale. But we're not the people who should be making decisions necessarily about conservation, protected area planning, land use planning, impact assessment. So that has to occur with our partners. So we're trying to develop as strong an information layer as possible. And as we develop this information layer, we want to involve as many people as possible, including decision makers, so that they understand the process, they understand what this means and what it doesn't mean, and can then are well placed to make use of this information for whatever processes and policy development is going on within a province or territory, or at other scales as well. You can press the next, yes. The other thing that makes this quite robust and quite interesting to governments is that it's not negotiated. KBA is a KBA. If you have sufficient information to be able to show that it's a KBA, it is. You cannot sort of veto a KBA. So it's purely quantitative. There's no discussion involved except for to make sure that we have access to the best knowledge and all of the knowledge that might help us make that assessment. But if we're missing data, if we're missing understanding of how well, for example, a species has been surveyed, we won't be able to identify a KBA at this time. Hopefully in the future, if we are then able to share that information about what species we need more information about. Next one. So we do take a regional focus, even though we're working across the country. We're now working pretty much in every province and territory, but we believe that regional leaders such as Ian can guide the work with their knowledge of landscapes, species, ecosystems, and networks of knowledge holders. So it's important to gather everyone up and make sure that everyone is aware of this process and provide opportunities for contributions. Ian will talk about that in a minute. Next point. So the process in a nutshell, and we have tons of webinars available online and short videos that can bring you through the technical process of how to identify a KBA, but it involves identifying biodiversity elements that qualify under the different standards, determining whether we have sufficient data to identify a site that holds the required proportion of a species population or an ecosystem extent, drawing a tight boundary around the biodiversity elements if the thresholds are met. So it's a bit of an iterative process to see, is this place a key biodiversity area, gathering up all that data, getting as much input from experts as possible, delineating it, and then just double checking to make sure that those thresholds are still met. Next. So it's a site-scaled approach to conservation or land use management. And there's lots of literature out there that shows that site-scaled approaches to conservation are quite an important aspect of conservation or an approach. When we say site, there is no upper or lower limit to how large a site or how small it should be. We have everything from 1 by 1 kilometer squared to hundreds of square kilometers. And for Criterion C, that's those sites with the highest ecological integrity, we may have sites up to 10,000 kilometers squared. In Canada, what is considered a site is quite different from, say, if you were looking at a site in Ireland. We have, some of the suggestions are to delineate sites based on existing boundaries, for example, of protected areas. But a place like Banff National Park is, bigger than many countries in the world. But we're supposed to sort of take that into account and try to identify a site at the scale of a site. So the next. Yeah, we can maybe even just like load all these points on so that I don't, so we can continue. But so this is a tool that is quite top down. It's very much based on ecological indicators and ecological elements. But we're committed to trying to make this as relevant to Indigenous-led conservation as possible as well. And those kinds of conversations are ongoing to figure out how it can feed into different Indigenous-led processes. It's management neutral, which means that it does have the potential to feed into any kind of process. So IPCAs, for example, Indigenous protected and conserved areas, are identified usually for other reasons than for the reasons that a key biodiversity area is identified. But key biodiversity areas could support those kinds of proposals, can provide additional evidence for the importance of a site based on sort of more ecological values, etc. So in order to improve the relevance of KBAs to IPCAs and potentially other forms of Indigenous-led conservation, participation is what we're going for at this point to try to figure out how we can support any of the Indigenous-led processes. All kinds of knowledge are suitable for key biodiversity area assessments if communities or Indigenous experts want to share that knowledge, which of course they don't have to do either. And KBAs may or may not align with biocultural values. We've done some work in Nova Scotia to try to figure out where the alignment is and where the gaps occur. So we're trying to expand that knowledge across Canada through, again, discussions and partnerships with groups like the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership. Next. And I'll try to end up pretty soon here because I think that I'm out of time. So this is just to show that we have quite a large structure in Canada for both the government governance and for the application of the KBA criteria across the country. On the left is the global structure. So we're very much in partner with a global infrastructure that makes sure that there's consistency across all key biodiversity areas in terms of how criteria are applied. In Canada, we work with all the major NGOs, as well as governments at the federal, provincial, territorial scale, and Indigenous partners. WCS Canada, Birds Canada, and NatureServe Canada are the three organizations that form the Secretariat, and we're sort of leading the process, but with the support of many, many others. And so, again, like I couldn't name all of them, but it's through the involvement of a lot of experts that we're getting this work done. Next. You can load them all up. So I think that the point here that I just want to say, I think it's the last couple of bullets that the bulk of the work will be done in 4 to 5 years. We had a year of planning, and then we're sort of halfway through the second year of application of KBA criteria and hiring people across the country to lead this work. We have a few more years to go because it turns out even identifying one KBA takes a huge amount of time, and we have multiple review processes. But to date, we have about 240 new species triggered KBAs. More to come, of course. There'll be several hundred. There's about 450, I don't think we would call them legacy KBAs, but they're the base of KBAs that are mostly important bird areas that are now being reassessed as KBAs. We have 22 new ecosystem KBAs in the prairies, more to come, and Lucy will mention those. And there's 50 new KBAs that are likely to be identified for Criterion C in the north, those high ecological integrity sites, including some in BC as well. We're already being included in federal and provincial and territorial land use planning and the development of some IPCAs, and we hope to continue to build those partnerships and make sure that decision makers know that this work and this data will be publicly available to everyone. Next. I won't go through all these. This is just a quick overview showing that we have all of these mostly regional initiatives. So again, coverage across all of Canada at this point, and then also some more thematic initiatives like identifying all freshwater key biodiversity areas across the country with a wonderful group of freshwater experts from across the country as well. Continue. And so you can visit our website for more information. We now have tons of amazing stuff on the website, and that will only continue to grow. So as I mentioned, a whole collection of webinars. We have newsletters that it would be great if you signed up for. There's lists of who you can contact for information about different aspects of the project, and sort of a notice of who's been involved and where this work is going. We'll continue to add to that, but I will end there for now. And thank you very much again for listening and being a part of this.
Great. Thank you, Kara. We'll keep moving through and again to take questions at the end. Next up is Zayd Jumian, Senior Land Use Biologist in Victoria with the Ecosystems Branch of the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change Strategy for BC Government.
Thanks, Ian.
Go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, thanks. I'm Zayd Jumian, and I'm a biologist with BC Ministry of Environment. Happy to be presenting from Victoria, where I live and work on the traditional territories of the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations. And I think right off the start, I just want to take the opportunity to acknowledge my co-author, Louise Blight, who's recently retired from government, but along with another colleague, Jason Straka, were instrumental in initiating and pursuing this initiative in BC. And so what I'd like to do today is to provide some perspectives on how KBAs can be used to inform conservation efforts through various ongoing programs within government. And I'll provide a background context on kind of the course direction that government has, where KBAs can be used as foundational information to support conservation efforts, and also run through some potential examples of how KBAs can be applied. And so mainly I'll speak to application of KBAs like at a hypothetical level, and for a couple of reasons. First, many of the programs that we envision KBAs supporting are relatively new and still under development. And so how we apply them strategically is still a bit of a question. And second is, like there's been a lot of work done on KBAs in BC over the past year, as you've heard from Kira, but most are still under development and not quite yet finalized. So next slide, please. So in terms of the current context and direction within government relative to biodiversity outcomes, I'll just start by referring to ministry mandate letters. So mandate letters from the Premier to ministers are important, increasingly important to guide the work that we undertake. And so in BC, current government's mandate letters from 2020 end up guiding some core ministry work. And some of the direction is creating potential opportunities to apply KBAs to a range of programs. And so specifically for environment, the Ministry of Environment's current 2020 mandate letter includes an action to, quote, continue to work with partners to protect species at risk and work collaboratively with other ministries to protect and enhance species biodiversity. And then an additional shared action between environment and our sister ministry, Forest Lands, Natural Resource Operations and Rural Development, states that FLNRO and environment will develop and invest in new strategies aimed at better protecting our shared wildlife and habitat corridors, including work to implement the Together for Wildlife strategy. Next slide, please. So that was environment. And so similarly for FLNRO, recent mandate letters support opportunities to consider KBA information as a tool to achieve actions relating to various conservation aspects. And so going back to their 2017 mandate letter, that includes an action to initiate modernized land use planning and sustainably manage BC's ecosystems, rivers, lakes, watersheds, forests, and old growth. And you'll see, like in the next couple of slides, although that's a 2017 mandate commitment, it's an active work stream today. And then additionally, in the 2020 mandate letter, there's this shared action with environment, which you heard on the previous slide. And I don't know if I need to repeat it here. So next slide. And then a recent and additional driver of support for continued KBA work is the recent 2021 announcement of the Canada-BC Nature Agreement. And the nature agreement builds on existing collaborative partnerships such as the Pathway to Canada Target 1 and the Pan-Canadian approach to transforming species at risk conservation in Canada. And in a nutshell, the bilateral agreement aims to enhance shared conservation goals between Canada and British Columbia, with the ultimate goal to strengthen conservation province-wide. And in addition, it includes notions of taking leadership together on, in addition to climate change and environmental protection, specifically here, conservation. And so BC is currently determining its priorities for possible conservation initiatives that federal funding from this agreement could help us advance. So in addition to a suite of other tools and programs, specifically for KBAs, knowing where existing and proposed KBAs are will support the identification of strategic conservation opportunities and priorities within the province. And we believe this will align well as a shared conservation goal of the federal government. So many of these drivers, as I've alluded to, have now become kind of active work streams or active initiatives within government and have created opportunities, like good windows of opportunities where we can explore how KBAs can support conservation planning aspects within them. So on the next few slides, I'll just run through some of these, what I call kind of semi-hypothetical examples of how KBAs might support these various initiatives. So next slide. So I'll start it with the Modernized Land Use Planning Initiative. And as I've mentioned, this is a very active stream of work in government right now. And it's an initiative that requires baseline data inputs. And it seems like KBA data could really lend itself well to slot in here as a key piece of baseline data. And so as an example, we've contacted, or we have been contacted by planners in the South Coast. And in the Shishal BC land use planning table on the Sunshine Coast, planners there are interested in knowing spatially where existing or proposed KBAs are in the traditional territory for consideration in broader strategic planning and more refined co-location exercises. And so conceivably, planning tables are interested in KBA data as a key piece of baseline data to explore how proposed KBA boundaries or existing KBA boundaries overlap with various conservation designations that planners are considering. So for example, we're talking about things like wildlife habitat area designations or ungulate winter range designations, OGMAs, biodiversity mining and tourism areas, indigenous protected and conserved areas, these kinds of things. And so the thought is that, where there's an opportunity to create a new designation, then planners can also explore opportunities for wholly or partially co-locating KBAs within the designation in question. Additionally, KBAs can be considered in the development of legal land use objectives through the Land Use Objectives Regulation Order to help conserve important environmental conditions associated with a KBA. And so this land use planning table is one example. We envision similar uses of KBAs at other planning tables to support conservation planning efforts. Next slide. Okay, so now I'll touch on nature agreements. So KBAs can help us in shaping the goals of the Canada-BC Nature Agreement, again, by serving as a key input layer to identify conservation priorities and opportunities. And so a data layer with identified KBAs can be included as value-added information alongside other strategic conservation mapping. So for example, we've initiated work around coarse filter conservation indicators, such as intact lands. And so the image that I'm showing here is showing work that we completed a few years ago on roads and roadless areas of BC indicator. And we've presented this as a kind of a coarse proxy for intact areas. And if you're interested, you can find that on the Environmental Reporting BC website. But now, like taking that the next step, knowing where KBAs co-locate with intact areas can be helpful in setting more strategic conservation objectives, as well as helping to address fine filter elements in conservation planning. And conversely, knowing where KBAs co-locate in disturbed areas can also help in management and restoration of habitat for target species that the KBA was identified for. And so similarly, as new coarse scale conservation opportunities or threat indicators are developed, so for example, we're currently working on developing an indicator for biodiversity macrorefugia, so essentially climate stable areas. Following the similar notion, KBAs can certainly be used as a value-added information to support strategic conservation decisions. Next slide, please. The last example I'll speak to is the Together for Wildlife initiative, and this is another active stream of work within government. So Together for Wildlife has goals and actions that KBAs will likely be helpful in addressing. So for example, goal 3 of the strategy states that stewardship actions achieve tangible benefits for wildlife. The strategy also has actions around priority lands for the province's conservation lands program. And action 11 states, we will make investments to manage existing conservation lands and acquire new priority lands for wildlife stewardship. Next slide, please. Okay, furthermore, related to the Conservation Lands Program, the recent Office of the Auditor General audited this program and found that BC has not effectively managed the conservation lands to conserve important habitats. And so the audit's first recommendation was that KBAs may be able to play a role in helping to rank sites for the Conservation Lands Program, and additionally recommends that staff work with conservation partners to establish a shared list of priority habitats for the program. And worth noting that government had accepted all of the recommendations of the Auditor General. So something like KBAs, which roll up multiple biodiversity values into a single data layer, can be a useful tool in supporting the identification of conservation priorities, which can then be rolled into conversations around how to best achieve goals and actions under Together for Wildlife, as well as respond to the Auditor General's report. Next slide, please. So in addition to the kind of discussed entry points for KBA work, I'll just briefly touch on a couple others. So Pathway to Canada Target 1, BC is on the National Steering Committee for this, and KBAs are fully supported as a way to meet commitments by some participating jurisdictions, and that includes British Columbia and the federal government. Additionally, local governments, have the ability to recognize important areas for biodiversity in official community plans. And for example, important bird areas, which are, as you heard from Kira, are now being kind of reassessed or being crosswalked to KBAs, have been used in the past by local governments to inform planning processes. And, one example is the Comox IBA on central Vancouver Island, which is officially recognized in their community plan. Next slide. And so just to kind of finish up here, ultimately, where KBAs can be used remains to be seen. But I think right now we have a lot of opportunities presenting themselves, which is, are really, really exciting for us at the moment. So KBAs will most certainly be a key analytical layer to help inform our ongoing priority conservation opportunities in BC. Additionally, one thing that we've noticed is that other government staff are quite interested in learning more about KBAs. And not only that, but have interest in final products as they start to kind of trickle out, to start to include the information in conservation considerations that are happening kind of, at a regional or at a more local level. And so the take home is there's lots of potential to apply KBAs in BC. And there seems to be a lot of excitement by the opportunity that they present. So, as I mentioned, this is exciting for all of us here, and we look forward to continuing to be involved. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Zayd. Next up is myself and my colleague, Liam Ragan. Liam is coordinator for the International Bird Area Program, shepherding the crosswalk of process of IBAs to KBAs. He'll be presenting bird aspect stuff within here, and I'll be talking about an overview of KBA in British Columbia. Next. So we've heard from Kara on the overall goals, objectives of the KBA program, and Zayd has provided us some background on how KBAs may be applied within British Columbia. We'll look to how the program is being rolled out in BC, how KBAs are being identified. I'll give some examples on status updates of where we are and where we're going. The goal is to have all KBA sites identified and approved within the province. That's obviously a lofty goal and will take some time, but we're making progress and we have help. BC has a rich population of ecologists, Indigenous peoples, naturalists, others who are highly knowledgeable and committed to ensuring our natural legacy continues, and many of you are here today. You are an essential part of this process. Next. In the KBA process, we first identify biodiversity elements, species, ecosystems, landscapes. For the most part, these are nationally and globally listed species at risk. We then find the places where these elements occur, sites, locations that are of the greatest importance and where they still persist today. Then, using the global and national standards that Kiara discussed, we assess if they meet these objective criteria. That's a hard yes or no situation using the most up-to-date data available. Those sites are spatially delineated to the extent where the element occurs. Some inference using adjacent habitat suitability can be used here, but that's highly localized. We're not using predictive habitat mapping or occupancy modeling. Real data and documented occurrence is essential to making these work. We then do the paperwork, preparing proposals that are thoroughly documented and referenced. These are sent to local and species experts for review to make sure that we have things right. Finally, the proposal is submitted to the KBA Secretariat for review and hopefully approved. Next. So Kiara touched on the 5 main criteria. I'll look at the 3 main ones that I'm involved with. Criterion A, biodiversity, doesn't necessarily mean a species diversity in this context. We're not looking for areas with a high Shannon-Wiener index. These sites are driven by individual species at risk. We want the best or most important sites where species at risk are known to occur now. So that's criterion A. Criterion B and D get at all species, not just listed ones, where unique or special conditions occur. Criterion B is for species with very limited range, either globally or nationally. Note that provincial rarity does not come into play for KBAs. So red listed, blue listed by the provincial CDC does not come into play. Criterion D is for areas of unique critical aspects to species or species assemblages. I'll look a bit more closely at these 3 main criteria. For criterion A, sites that support minimum thresholds of population size for listed species or taxa. Remember that global KBAs go to the species level, national ones can take that to an infraspecies or subspecies level. This can be inferred through a number of individuals, area of occupancy, range, and number of other metrics. They must also be documented to support a minimum number of reproductive units within the last decade. So in BC, we've identified 106 species as potential global triggers, while 793 taxa using infraspecies have been identified. An example is Canada's favorite endemic, the Vancouver Island marmot, is a species listed as critically endangered by IUCN, ranked E1, Kasiwik endangered. It's criterion A1A specifically. It's also a criterion B trigger because it's geographically restricted. So any site that supports more than 0.5% of the global population and has 5 or more reproductive units is a KBA site. Those are some of the fine scale metrics that we have to look at. Blue-gray tail dropper is an elegant slug from southern Vancouver Island. It is Kasiwik threatened, so it meets a slightly lower criterion. As a threatened species, the population threshold is a bit higher at 1% of national population with 10 or more reproductive units within a delineated site. Next. Criterion B sites are those that hold at least 10% of a species or taxa's global or national range respectively. Most endemic elements apply here. Examples include the Brookside subspecies in northern saw-whet owl, a Haida Gwaii endemic subspecies. Another candidate is the Morrison Creek population of western brook lamprey near Courtney, which has been shown to be genetically unique from all other populations of the same species. Note that these are both national examples because they are at the infra-species level. In BC, there's 72 that have been identified as likely meeting the global criteria, while another 46 elements may meet the national criteria if we look at them a bit more closely. Next. On Criterion D, we look at ecological processes. These include large aggregations, areas that are critical during times of environmental stress, or for recruitment during the breeding process. Examples of potential areas in BC include large bat hibernacula, seabird or shorebird aggregations, some seasonal aggregations, or relatively restricted salmon spawning areas that meets the reproductive aspects. Like other criteria, these have quantitative thresholds that must be documented for approval as a KBA. Next. So an example is the site used to test the Canadian National Standard KBA standards that was appropriately named Trial Islands. A small group of 5 islands about 4 kilometers off McNicholing Point in Victoria. These are low islands of meadows, shrub thickets, sparse plant communities on exposed bedrock, supporting a remarkable assemblage of rare and geographically restricted species. Next. So although at least 17 listed species are known to occur on these islands, 2 species, Victoria owl clover and McCown's meadow foam, were selected as the triggers for the formal KBA because detailed and recent population data are available. Most of this work is led by Matt Fairbairn, who I think is on the call today, and thank you, Matt, for that work. Victoria owl's clover is listed as G1. Globally, it's an N1 species under nature reserve and Kasiwik endangered. McCown's meadow foam is the slightly lower level of endangerment, G2 national population, national N2 by nature reserve and Kasiwik threatened. Provided population criteria met, these would qualify as KBA status. Next. So when we look at, from there, once we have that level of endangerment, then we look at the specific details of the population numbers. This is the numbers that are reported to us by Matt. Victoria owl clover islands have well over the 0.5 global population threshold, and well more as well than the 5 reproductive units. It's therefore a global KBA under criterion A1A. Note that because it also has more than 10% of the entire global population, it also meets criterion B1 under as well. McCown's meadow foam was at the G2 and Kasiwik threatened status level, so its thresholds are a bit higher, but are still being met. Over 1% of the global population and more than 10 reproductive units. Therefore, the global KBA status is met there as well. These are just a couple examples where I've tried to quickly show how the numbers are required to make KBAs approved. Next. Birds are a taxon receiving their own special approach to KBA identification, but must meet the same rigorous criteria. I'll pass it over to Liam now. We'll talk more about the birds.
Thanks, Ian. Once again, my name is Liam Reagan. I'm the Provincial Coordinator for the Important Bird Areas program in BC. For those unaware, the IBA program is a global initiative started by BirdLife International, hosted nationally by Nature Canada and Birds Canada, and implemented here in BC by BC Nature and Birds Canada. Next slide. So we have 83 IBAs in BC that are known. As Ian and Kiara mentioned, we're currently in the process of evaluating them to ensure that we can qualify them as KBAs. And that is a process which has been spearheaded by Birds Canada. They have conducted a national level review of all IBAs in the country. And in BC, we came out with some of the best results for data quality, which we attribute to our active caretaker program. Those are volunteers who steward each of our IBA sites and ensure that we continue to get data in, that the IBAs stay up to date, and that when conservation threats occur, we're aware of them and are able to act in turn where appropriate. As you can see here, 27 of the 83 sites, so about a third, came in as no issue. Given all we know, they will qualify as a KBA right off the bat with no extra data required. 39, so about half, came in as data deficient, meaning that the data for those sites was either from 1 year of data, one observation, or the data was outdated. We're currently looking into those ones to see if there's data missing from the analysis that Birds Canada conducted, i.e., written notes, things that caretakers wrote down, or simply databases that weren't included in Birds Canada's analysis. And then lastly, 17, or about 1/5 of IBAs lacked preliminary data, meaning there was no data included in the databases that Birds Canada reviewed to ensure that they qualified as a KBA. So our next steps for this is that we're currently, again, searching out new data, anything that was missed. We are recruiting new caretakers to ensure that sites that might be data deficient have all the support they need to monitor them effectively. And lastly, we are planning surveys for sites where we deem there is no additional data that was missed, but we believe it's simply a matter of getting out and resurveying them. Many of our IBAs, for reference, are remote marine sites with nesting colonies that haven't been effectively surveyed since the 80s or early 90s when they were first identified by Canadian Wildlife Services. Next slide. So this is just a quick map that goes over kind of a visual demonstration of what that data looks like. The red ones, as you can see, are global KBAs. Look like they will become global KBAs. The yellow ones look like they will become national KBAs. And anything that doesn't is either gray, that's gray, doesn't have preliminary qualifying data and we're looking into. And blue outlined ones are the sites which we have identified need additional data to follow up on. So yeah, I'll pass it back to Ian with that. And thank you.
Thanks, Liam. Next. I'll just finish up with where we're looking at where the program is currently and where we're headed within BC. Now, we all know that BC sports a high level of biodiversity nationally in Canada. Our database of taxa eligible as A1 or B1 criteria confirms this. The graph shows here over 900 taxa are eligible for consideration. That does not mean all of these will meet KBA criteria or necessarily form KBAs, but it does show the importance of BC to the national conservation efforts and as well the amount of work ahead of us. Next. So looking at where we're at within the effort, work started in 2020 on the identification and delineation of KBAs within BC by my predecessor, Riley. Now, many of today's call have participated in workshops held a year ago. There included whales, Haida-Gwaii plants, herptiles, several others. Currently, there's over 150 KBAs in progress in BC, including existing IBAs that are being crosswalked to the KBA program that Liam was just discussing. These represent at least 170 taxa exclusive of the bird trigger species. Note that IBAs that are shown on this map and the line work is by no means finalized. The IBAs are not shown on this map and the line work is not finalized. Next. So looking to the future, we'll be hosting more workshops that many of you can hopefully attend and contribute with your knowledge. The process is reliant on the wealth of knowledge across the province. And the role that knowledge holders have is critical. Incorporating Indigenous knowledge is an area we're focusing on, as well as the ongoing direct science work that many of you are engaged with daily. David Fraser will talk about the role of experts and local knowledge holders. In other words, how you can help out various stages, including identification, delineation, and review. He'll be up very shortly. Next. Sites in progress are publicly available on the KBA website at kbacanada.org. Note that these sites are just located with a dot. They don't show the actual line work. Final data will be available in a public registry that's in the works and it will be co-managed by Birds Canada. We do partner with Conservation Data Center and NatureServe, fully respect all data on sensitive species and manage it appropriately. So if you are working with a sensitive species, we do keep that into consideration. Next. That's it. Thanks for listening. We'll gladly take questions at the end of the session. And next up, I'll introduce Lucy Poli, who is discussing on how ecosystems work in the Criterion C. Lucy is the ecosystems coordinator for KBAs with the Wildlife Conservation Society of Canada. Her work focuses on those ecosystem candidates as well as ecological integrity. Go ahead, Lucy.
Thanks, Ian. Yeah, that was a great introduction, so I don't need to say anything else about myself. I'll try and move through this quickly because we're nearing the end of our time together. So one of the great things about the KBA program is that it recognizes that species, individual species, are not the only important elements of biodiversity worth protecting. So ecosystems are also valuable as a whole, as communities of species and their physical environment. Being that KBA initiative is a global program, we do need a consistent definition of what an ecosystem actually is across the world. So within the KBA Global Standard, we have this definition of what an ecosystem type is, a unit for standard and repeatable assessment at an intermediate level in a globally consistent ecosystem classification hierarchy. That's important because there are many different ways of classifying ecosystems, so we do need this consistency across the world. Ecosystem types are defined by a particular set of variables related to characteristic native biota, an abiotic environment or complex, the interactions within and between these, and a physical space in which these operate. So more than just a single species ecosystem represents a community. Next slide. So there are three sub-criteria or criteria that encompass the ecosystems in the KBA program. And the first of those is Criterion A2, which talks about threatened ecosystem types. So with these criteria, or this criterion, KBAs that would be designated as an A2 site need to hold a significant proportion of the global, or for national KBAs, the national extent of a threatened ecosystem. So these would be ecosystem types that have been assessed globally as critically endangered, or vulnerable under the IUCN Red List of Ecosystems. So similar to the Red List of Species, IUCN now has a Red List of Ecosystems that looks for the threatened status of ecosystems around the world. So in order to qualify as an A2 site, it needs to hold one or more of the following: at least 5% of the global or national extent of a globally critically endangered or endangered ecosystem type, or at least 10% of the global or national extent of a globally vulnerable ecosystem type. So this criterion is all about protecting or designating as KBAs the threatened ecosystem types. Criterion B4, on the other hand, is related to the geographically restricted ecosystem types. So not necessarily red listed as threatened or vulnerable, but geographically restricted. So there's not a lot of this ecosystem type either nationally or globally. So to qualify as a B4 site, KBAs need to hold a significant proportion of the global or national extent of a geographically restricted ecosystem. And specifically, the site needs to hold at least 20% of the global or national extent of an ecosystem type. So it doesn't have to be red listed, but your site needs to hold a larger proportion of this particular ecosystem type. The third ecosystem criterion is Criterion C. This one's a little bit different because it's a focus on ecological integrity. So that's somewhat of a broad term and sometimes a vague term to define, and there's always challenges with that kind of definition. But the goal of this criterion is to find sites that hold wholly intact ecological communities with supporting large-scale ecological processes. These are measured both in terms of the biotic integrity of the site as a whole, things like species composition, species abundance, interactions between species, and species functioning ecologically as they should, as well as, in addition to, very low or absence of direct industrial human impact. So in order to qualify as a Criterion C site, a site needs to be one of 2 or less per ecoregion, characterized by the wholly intact ecological communities comprising the composition and abundance of native species and their interactions. And with Criterion C, we're looking for the big sites. So these are going to be the largest KBAs in Canada, most likely. They should be delineated to be at least 10,000 kilometers squared in size, within the confines of what would be manageable should they be managed in the future, but we're looking for really big areas here with Criterion C. Next slide. So I'll talk a little bit about each of those criteria types individually. First of all, we have A2 and B4, and although they're not exactly the same, ecosystem types will likely be assessed for qualification for both of these criteria simultaneously. So what you need to apply these criteria first is actually map and classify ecosystem types at the appropriate level. So remember that I mentioned that we're looking for an intermediate level and a globally consistent ecosystem hierarchy. British Columbia has a really good ecosystem classification system already, which probably some of you are familiar with. So the goal is to ensure that and how that ecosystem classification lines up with something like this, which would be, it's gone. Yeah, you're gonna do one more. There you go. Perfect. This is the general hierarchy of a globally consistent ecosystem classification. This is from the International Vegetation Classification. So once you as if you're looking at this map or this table, you can see that it moves kind of from at the upper levels, very broad definitions of ecosystems from very super general forest and woodland, getting a little more specific in terms of climate, location. And then as you move down to the mid and lower levels, you're getting more and more specific as to what vegetation is actually found at those levels. So in order to determine the conservation status of an ecosystem according to the IUCN Red List of Ecosystems, we're looking to classify ecosystem areas or types in these two L6 and L7 levels. So the group level would be for most forests that we're considering, and then you can get a little bit more specific with non-forested ecosystems into the alliance level. Next point. So we've mapped and classified ecosystem types at the appropriate level. We've determined their conservation status. The next important thing would be to calculate either the global or national ecosystem extent. And for global, this is particularly important because many of these ecosystem types, especially in southern BC, are shared with northern United States. So that's why it's key to have this globally consistent hierarchy that you can apply on both sides of the border. Next point. And then to determine how much of your area of interest of that ecosystem type or of the global or national extent is included, you need to also calculate the regional ecosystem type extent. And then we can look at these numbers. So if your delineated ecosystem contains 5% of the global or national extent if it's critically endangered or endangered, 10% if it's vulnerable, or 20% if it's geographically restricted. If it meets those thresholds, then we can start to delineate that area as an ecosystem KBA and make our KBA proposal. Next slide. So I'm not going to go into detail here. This work is ongoing in collaboration with BC ecologists, ecosystem scientists, and some people from NatureServe in the United States. This is just a brief list of some of the ecosystem types at the group or alliance level. Well, I think these are group level that are likely to qualify or potentially qualify for A2 or B4 ecosystem types in BC. So a number of the dry oak ecosystems, some of the hemlock and Sitka spruce ecosystems, some grasslands and sagebrush steppe, ponderosa pine, some of the subalpine in the Rocky Mountains, and tidal salt and brackish marsh, so some of the coastal ecosystems. It's possible there are more, but these are the ones that are currently being examined. Next slide. For Criterion C, we go a little bit differently because we're looking for these humongous areas. So we've so far conducted a national scoping analysis for Criterion C with the goal of taking into account the low levels or absence of industrial disturbance in Canada. That's a little bit easier to immediately quantify than things like biotic integrity. So what we did was we collected a number of data layers representing human pressures, things like a human footprint, roads, cities, population density, agriculture, industrial activity. We have data on the integrity within forest regions of forests or a measure of deforestation, and then the connectivity of rivers and how that's been affected or decreased due to human activity. So we applied these data layers systematically across the country, and the result is areas of at least 10,000 kilometers squared where we have low levels of these human pressures. So this is a map of BC. The light gray lines indicate ecoregions. They're at the global level and not the Canadian level, if they look a little different than what you'd be used to. And each colorful blob in here represents a potential area in which we need to further examine ecological integrity. So you can see mainly in the north, a little bit in the Rocky Mountains in the east, and then in the coastal regions in the west, we have some potential areas that at least have low human pressure. And so we're going to take these areas and move on to our next steps. So what we need to do now is seek out regionally relevant data and in particular local expert knowledge covering each of these areas to determine if any of these sites would actually qualify for KBA-C and where. And with these regional level data sets and expert knowledge, what we're really focusing on is confirming that our analysis of human pressures are correct and that they're either present or absent where we think they are, and that we didn't miss anything or add something that's no longer on the landscape. And then really important will be to evaluate biotic integrity and ecosystem function components of integrity in greater detail. So look at species, presence and abundance, the environment that they live within, and interactions with those. So this work is ongoing as well, and I'm sure some of you will be in contact with you to seek out your expert knowledge and regional data for these. That's all from me, so I'll pass it back to Ian.
Great, thank you, Lucy. I notice we're coming up to the top of the hour here. Sorry we're running a little bit long. Hopefully you're able to stay with us to hear David Fraser's talk next, and any questions that you might have. For those of you who do have to leave, we are recording it and it will be available afterwards. So David Fraser, of course, needs no introduction to most of us here today, but I'm going to do it anyways. Retired from the BC government as the Species at Risk Specialist, David is a longtime CSIC member, a wealth of knowledge on BC's biodiversity. David co-authored the National KBA Standards, sits on the National Secretariat. He'll be talking today to you on how you can help the KBA process, and in particular, the essential role of species and local experts. Go ahead, David.
Okay, thanks very much, Ian. For those of you that were listening to Kara's presentation, you probably get an idea of how important experts are. She used the word expert 17 times in a 17-minute presentation. So they are key to us being able to deliver this stuff and to make sure we've got the information that's as up-to-date and relevant as possible. So when we're talking about experts, we're talking about species experts, ecosystem experts, plant community experts, or people that have got expertise on the local area. And all that becomes important when we're making assessments about the KBA and where those lines are going to be, how we're going to delineate that. We need to have the most up-to-date information to make sure that that's as well done as possible. So having somebody who's an expert on a local area can tell us that, that blob is now under a shopping center, or yeah, we can expand this line out to here because it's the same sort of habitat and there have been occurrences there. So that's a really important part of the process. Experts have been really important. Most of our KBA identification so far has been revolving around species at risk. And in that case, there's a whole bunch of stuff going on with species at risk. The last KBA workshop I worked on was on reptiles and amphibians in Ontario. And they're having really up-to-date information from the experts there told us whether or not species thresholds had changed from what we already knew, what was already in that latest CSIC status report or the latest conservation data center information. Really critical to making sure that we're not spending time identifying a KBA that would actually no longer qualify. So keeping us focused and up to date is one of those roles that experts have. What does an expert get out of participating? I sort of did a brainstorming exercise this morning, and the very first word I wrote down was, it's a nerd fest. It's an opportunity for species experts to get together with like-minded individuals and talk about the things that they really think are important, that maybe they don't get a lot of friends that think they're important, but those species experts have a wealth of information, and it gives you an opportunity to share it with other folks, and very, very helpful. We've used them a lot in the identifications we've done so far in the A criteria. We've done less on some of the other criteria, but I think they're going to be absolutely critical on the B and D criteria, where we don't have a wealth of information on locations the way we do for species at risk. We don't have a conservation data center that carries that sort of information. So expert knowledge will become increasingly important as we move down the criteria and spend more time working on some of the other triggers. Lastly, I wanted to encourage people that if you're asked to participate in the call, you say yes. Expert input is so important to this process, and it's a great opportunity to make sure that your knowledge is being used in a way that will identify some of the most important sites for biodiversity conservation in Canada. What did I do, Ian? Did I catch us up?
That sounds great. Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Dave. Things that I would like to look at is, in terms of people helping out, is hopefully talk to the College of Applied Biology and see if we can't ensure that for those of you who are RP bios are able to claim that perhaps as professional development activities and stuff. So make sure there is perhaps some kickback to biologists as well on that. So at this point, I think we're finished with formal presentations. We can turn it over to you guys with questions. There's been some questions come up in the chat box if people have been following along there. I'm not sure, Peter, hopefully you can help me out here if any of those have not been answered. Pierre in particular has been putting some answers in here. So if there are aspects that, or anything that we don't think has been fully answered yet there, otherwise we can start taking questions.
Yep, and just as a note to everybody, you should be able to unmute yourselves if you'd like to ask your question in person as well.
I believe Frances has her hand up as far as I can see. Go ahead, Frances.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Good to see some familiar names and great work, everybody. Just one question for myself, just for clarity. For these KBAs, do they undergo a threat assessment when the line work's complete? Just thinking in terms of, again, just prioritizing, we have so much resources, right, at our, when we start to implement conservation measures, but having a bit of a threat assessment done on some of these KBAs would certainly help inform where to put more resources into protecting these values, et cetera. So thanks, everybody.
Great question. Yeah, part of the proposal that we put in for KBAs does include listing of threats where those are known. So certainly where species, for instance, if species has been assessed by CSIC or provincially, would have a formal threat assessment completed with it. So we would be looking at that. And otherwise, if the threat assessment hasn't been done, then that's where, again, the role of local experts and species experts would come in as identifying whether it's at risk of coming under a shopping mall in the near future or otherwise is under some sort of threat. So there's not a formal threat assessment gone through for each one, but we do look at each of those and identify those where they have been.
A question from Ruth Simmons in the chat that I think was touched on, but we could elaborate a little more on is, can you explain more about work in marine areas? For example, glass sponge reef areas, current marine refuges, or within marine protected areas? Are they being included as well?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Marine aspects are included. The KBAs cover all ecosystem types from ocean bottoms to mountaintops. So certainly those areas are done. Again, we had a orca session last year that identified KBAs for orcas with a team of experts that looked at that. So many of those particularly larger KBAs that were on that map that I had in my presentation were orca-based ones. Those ones there, the glass sponge reefs have aware of those certainly, and potential for an ecosystem type of KBA. If there's individual species within those, we can certainly look at those individually as other different species-specific criteria for KBAs. Just if there is other things in there. So yeah, certainly that those are included in there. Can KBAs, Wendy Terrell with Islands Trust Conservancy has asked if KBAs are available on private lands, and the answer is yes. These are essentially trying to doing it blind to land status. So whether that's provincial crown land, private land, federal land, it's where the value occurs, not how that land is managed. And again, the KBAs offer no management prescription, no formal protection aspects to it. It's strictly an informative, this is where the value occurs. And so yes, absolutely, it could be on private land. Anyone? Anything else above us there, Peter? Just going back through the chat if there's other questions.
One question from a little further up. How can I get my local KBA IBA recognized by the regional district or local government?
Right, I think that was Diane actually. Thanks for joining us, Diane. The KBA certainly. Back, Zayd was talking about how they can be worked into land use planning processes. So certainly at that larger land use planning processes, we've met with land use planning staff with BC government as part of that, probably within official community planning processes that include environmental values, whether that's as development permit areas or things like that. Certainly to date, regional districts and municipalities look to species at risk listings and things like that, more specific aspects. KBAs fit very well within that land use planning process, whether it's official community plans or other things. So certainly discussions with local regional district councillors and municipal staff, making sure that they're aware of KBAs is always good if you're making the phone calls. So other than that, certainly they're on our list of people to have outreach work to make sure that everybody as possible is aware of KBAs and what they are and the potential uses and implementation. Looking at down here, Diane also asks if there's interest in federal government using KBA data to provide some legal protection. A while ago, they promised to increase percentage of protected areas, and definitely yes. Certainly the federal government, ECCC, is a partner with the KBA program, and are looking at using this as one of the opportunities within Pathway to Nature 1 and other federal initiatives. Susan has asked, why are provincial designations not considered in KBA planning? That I think is mostly that it's data driven. So it's data, the designations are data on where the species occurs, and that the main thing. So it's trying to keep that ecologically based. So it's where that occurs and what the land use management, the land use scheme is on top of that, whether it's in a provincial park or an ecological reserve or in downtown Vancouver, doesn't really matter. It's where that species value occurs, and then how that might be protected is up to other organizations to implement that. And I'll add if other folks, Lucy or Kara, whoever, Peter, want to jump in on any of these.
Dave might want to jump in on that one. Dave,
Okay. Yeah, I already had my button unmuted. The species that are listed at risk by the CDC at the provincial level, that feeds into the national process. So if a species is listed at risk in BC by the CDC, and many of those species that are in that state only occur in Canada in BC. So all of those would be considered as potential triggers. So we don't really ignore it. It just gets fed in. It's done through a national process. We don't have a KBA program at the provincial levels yet, but at the national level, many of those species that are listed by the CDC would be triggers.
Great, thanks. And so to add with that, I know Lucy was talking about red listed ecosystems, and just a clarification that that's IUCN red listed ecosystems, not the CDC red listed ecological communities. So in some cases where those will be IUCN red listed areas, but certainly when we as BC folks hear red listed, we often default to CDC red listed species or ecosystems. As Kara said, that data and iNaturalist being referenced, yes. Yep, it has to be research, what's the term? Research quality, essentially the ones where iNaturalist gets confirmed by another user. So if someone's putting on their houseplants into iNaturalist, we don't pull those data in. It's just the research grade of confirmed occurrences. But there, we also have access to handle that sensitive data is we do get the actual location, so obscured locations of things like snake dens or sensitive data are actual locations that we have access to.
A question coming in from further up the chat, probably that a couple of people could jump in on. Without legal mechanisms for protection, species will decline and ecosystems will continue to degrade. How will KBAs actually help provide tangible benefits to species and ecosystems?
Do you want to take that one, Kara? Or David?
Sure, and certainly maybe Zayd might have some comments on it for BC in particular. So absolutely, I think that key biodiversity areas in and of themselves can do nothing, but what they can do is provide some very concrete, robust information that governments trust to help them decide on some concrete activities and processes and policies that can protect species and ecosystems. So to date, I think because this is a quantitative approach and because it's so participatory and transparent, governments across the country have signaled to us that they absolutely do trust the KBA outputs, which come, and there was another question about this before, but they come with a lot of documentation and sort of, I mentioned that it's very time consuming. It's because of the amount of information that needs to be compiled and reviewed multiple times, and you can't just have one person do it. So Ian has his plate full, but for each key biodiversity area, he also needs to involve multiple experts, and that before we even get to those review processes. So because of that, governments are demanding this data and information, because it's not just one NGO doing this work. Can it be trusted? Can it not? Is it just them putting forward their conservation agenda? It is seen as a very neutral piece of information that can feed into land use planning, conservation planning, protected area planning. So a very concrete way that we're not clearly interacting with those species designations or single species policies. But by feeding into land use planning, which we're already doing, and into the federal government's land acquisition program, because they are trying to get to 30% of terrestrial lands protected by 2030, and they are using key biodiversity area information and data and spatial files already to figure out where they should be prioritizing land acquisitions. 30% is huge. We're only barely at 17%. So there is a good possibility that we can feed into that process in a way that makes a big difference, especially with some of our larger sites, but also some of the smaller sites that are just as important, that are in more urban and peri-urban areas that people rely on for both, I mean, it's for the persistence of species and ecosystems, but also for their interactions with nature and just, the things that we value hugely. I'll end it there, but I'm sure other people, especially in BC in particular, could add something as well.
Yeah, Zayd here. I mean, that was a great answer, Kira. I don't have much more to add to that, aside from just reiterating, like, I think the value of it is that it is this kind of, evidence-based process that's, data-driven or evidence-driven. And so that, like, right there, that gives it kind of the lens of neutrality on it. And it is a well-vetted process. And so to actually, like, to get to your question, to make them meaningful and to achieve benefits and outcomes, it is looking for those opportunities where, we ultimately will end up with this kind of core baseline data layer, and then looking for those opportunities to kind of feed that into where decisions are being made, and and provide, not necessarily make the case, but provide kind of the context or the background into, this is what KBAs are, this is why they're important, and this is, why you should consider this through whatever processes is going on. And there's lots of opportunities, like there's land use planning in BC, there's pathway to Canada Target 1, and there's opportunities, I think, on the policy side to kind of look at KBAs and consider, more formally biodiversity objectives. And so it's kind of that, it's that extra, and that's the challenging part, like kind of taking it from data to kind of supporting decisions.
Great. Look at another one. Rachel Darville. Hello, Rachel. Asked if there are other regulatory statuses being considered, example, Ramsar with wetlands. That doesn't really feed into the KBA process per se. Where other designations may come into play is when governments, or other agencies, things like BC government or the federal government, is looking as to where to meet those protected area targets. If a site has a Ramsar designation and a KBA designation and a couple of other separate designations, that just adds into the value that site probably will have ecologically, and add to the importance of it, and increase hopefully its likelihood of some other form of protection or management policy that leads to it. So it's essentially another layer that adds on to that importance. Jared Hobbs, hey Jared, has asked if the initiative underway under the Canada-BC Nature Agreement to implement legal protection within KBAs. KBAs and private land, yes, they can be on private lands. And again, not in terms of implementing legal protection on KBAs, that's up to the individual government, the separate governments, in order to identify those and how they want to handle and address the values that the KBA process will identify that is on those lands. Continuing down the list, Wendy with Islands Trust, what instances where a biological expert has observed a KBA species on private land, but the private landowner has not provided permission to record an occurrence? In other words, its occurrence is not recorded with CDC. When we're filling out our forms, it's documenting the evidence of where we got that. So it would, whether that's presumably if the observation has been there on the private land, it would be however that observation was made, whether it's an iNaturalist or some other means, if it's somebody looking across a fence from a neighbor or something. I'm not exactly sure how that might work out, but for the KBA process, that again, that documentation is essential, that it's reviewed, and essentially a peer review process by species and local experts. So certainly we're not trespassing and jumping over fences to go look for species on people's private land, but where that has reasonable documentation and justified documentation, then to me, it would be a valid observation. Again, we have to have precedent. So just seeing one yellow-breasted chat on private land in the South Okanagan does not make it a KBA. There are those thresholds, meeting for the most endangered is 0.5% of the national or global population. You need at least 5 reproductive units, which is, I believe, a breeding pair of yellow-breasted chats in that example. So seeing one individual in a cherry tree orchard in the South Okanagan does not necessarily make it a KBA. Next question here, is there any thoughts for future biodiversity corridors and not just isolated ecosystems? That I think is a really good question. Certainly connectivity is a major issue within conservation biology. And I might ask either David or Kara if that sounds almost like a separate criterion that the KBA Secretariat might consider in the future as a separate criteria.
It's a difficult one to establish a quantitative threshold for, and this is why. So we want to really stress here that KBAs can't be everything to everyone, and that alone they are not sufficient to develop, for example, if you were a protected area planner, an adequate protected area plan. So as part of the Pathway to Canada Target 1, and I did actually answer this further up, so that's why I'm answering it again, just so that, because I already have the answer prepared. But we were one of several working groups to feed into protected area planning in Canada. So key biodiversity areas, because they were quantitative, robust, scientifically designated or identified. But there was also a working group on connectivity that we worked closely with to try to figure out if we could develop synergies and work together, align our goals. There was a working group on Indigenous protected and conserved areas, and there's a working group on representativity as well. So all of that, those were considered the quality elements of a good protected area planning exercise across multiple years. Pathway to Canada Target 1 is sort of winding down, but hopefully will continue to exist within a new iteration going forward for the next decade of biodiversity targets that Canada will sign on to, I'm sure. So certainly it's not something that can be considered within the key biodiversity area standard, but it is key to proper management of species and ecosystems moving forward. And so I guess that's all I need to say.
Great, thanks. Graham has asked if we've identified a candidate site or multiple sites for region, mid-Vancouver Island, for example. Who should we reach out to for support and expertise at supporting our proposal? That would be myself. I'll put my email in the chat again here. You can reach out to me at any time. We'll also have the slide decks sent out to everyone who registered, so contact information will be on there. Secondly, a couple of key IBAs sites in our region. Should we assume that these are being moved forward as KBAs without regional stakeholder involvement? Meaning we do not need to prioritize supporting these proposals as they are in process. That's Liam, who's shepherding that IBA to KBA process. So I believe that's correct, but I'll let him speak to that more directly.
That's correct. Sorry, did that come through? I was just confirming.
There you go, Liam. Yep. Okay, yep, so that's him. Looks like KBAs appear to be an academic exercise only unless there's regulatory instruments in place to require protections. This will be an exercise in documenting the demise. Certainly they are, and they're identified, the objective is to identify where the values occur. Zayd's talk, I think, showed how they can be implemented by the provincial government. Kara touched base on one of the main selling points of KBAs as being an entirely objective, non-negotiable exercise. So it either meets KBA criteria or it does not. And because of that, they are accepted as being very high value conservation sites and candidates for further protections. We use CSIWIC assessments, not SARA assessments. One of the difficulties, downfalls of SARA is it brings in the political aspects of, do we want to accept and provide legal protection to a species that this CSIWIC body has recognized as being endangered or threatened? We take that scientific assessment, not the political assessment of SARA. So it's that objective level that allows KBAs to be a more acceptable and broadly reviewed process that allows other governments in place to implement them on the ground. Hopefully that makes the questions. If David or Kara or others want to sort of chime in on that, or Zayd, as to the value of KBAs.
Yeah, I would just add, like, I mean, I can empathize with the notion. What we've been seeing here, though, is that KBAs are certainly filling a data gap, and there is, you know, talking to colleagues and others, there is a lot of interest in starting to be able to roll this kind of information into, you know, those kind of decision processes where you can start to make meaningful impacts on either protecting the areas, conserving them, or, you know, potentially looking to otherwise manage or restore those areas to kind of a certain standard. So, right, they don't in themselves confer any kind of management on them, but it is a key, you know, they're filling a key gap to start to, you know, support those kinds of decisions.
I'll just add one quick thing, which is that I agree with that. Hopefully we can all contribute to real actions on the ground. I wouldn't say that it's purely academic for the reasons that Zayd just provided. I would also, the thing I wanted to add was that KBAs draw attention to all sorts of amazing values on the landscape that no one has paid any attention to. So it's not just, you know, caribou, but you can have KBAs for, you know, a spider that no one has ever really noticed, or these wonderful little vascular plants and lichens that don't get any conservation attention and nobody knows where they are. And so to have them on a map with a, you know, a line around them, and that feed into government planning, that's new, and that's actually drawing attention to all sorts of values that are just as important as potentially caribou, maybe not as charismatic. So I hope this makes a difference, and certainly there's even, we need activism, but we also need sort of good information in the hands of decision makers.
We are coming up to the bottom of the hour here in whatever time zone you're in. So there's some other questions and discussions coming up here. I'm happy to stick around for a little bit longer. I'm not sure if Teams will allow us to do that. We can keep doing that. So if people need to move on and get on to other business of the day, feel free to do so. But we can sort of continue that discussion if we'd like.
And just as a reminder as well, we'll send out the recording of the talk and the slides. And if you've enjoyed the discussion today, please do join the monthly webinar series that we'll be hosting on the last Thursday of the month. The first one will be this Thursday at 9 a.m. Pacific, 10 a.m. Mountain, 12 noon Eastern, about identification, going from identification to implementation. So how do we use KBAs in conservation, and what sort of creative strategies can we come up with? Please join that if you're interested in more.
Good. Thank you, and thanks everyone for joining us. We'll take this, I'll look at the chat as well and try to answer those perhaps more written wise down the road as well. Yeah, we'll probably have a link out to the recording. Will be massive in size, so we'll probably have a link to that on our website, I would think. So that would be good. Go back up. Do you want to? Are we okay to keep going, Peter, or do you need to move on? Or
yep, I think we can keep it open for another 5 minutes and just answer the questions that are here. But if anyone has to go, please don't stick around if you can't.
I will go. Thank you, everyone. Thanks
Great.
very much for organizing this, Ian and Peter. And thanks for everyone.
Aaron Clement asked if an area is already an IBA and Ramsar, adding or switching to the KBA without regulatory support may not provide more protection. Will KBAs help inform funding programs and grants? With no regulations attached, it can be difficult for local governments to impart policies on private land. I think the main question there, will KBAs help inform funding programs or grants? Certainly, I think it has the ability to do that. That, of course, is up to the funding agencies, whether that's something like federal programs like HSP or that, or provincial programs through the Fish and Wildlife Compensation Programs or Habitat Conservation Trust issues, or other more direct land kind of things. Certainly recognizing that and adding that in as one of their, not necessarily a criteria that you have to be, but added bonus points if you are working within a KBA. Certainly, I would hope that might be something that they would look at. That's up to those individual granting organizations. There are aspects within that. Adding, switching, again, it's not switching. The IBAs are being moved over to KBAs, as it were. But it's certainly, there is support is working closely with. And so those are, I think those are recognized as I think.
Yeah. If I can provide a little IBA context,
sure.
as
Yeah.
well.
Go ahead.
Yeah. I would just say, the reasoning, the underlying motivations for identifying an IBA site aren't, buffleheads just love this piece of ocean, or, herons just really love to aggregate here. It's the ecological community that makes up that area. And so in a kind of philosophical sense, identifying an IBA as a KBA is strengthening the actual conservation designation we lend to it. And from a funding perspective, as I'm sure everyone in attendance is aware, there are many, many grants specified to different taxa, different type of habitats concerns, and imparting a KBA designation does make action at a site more fundable. The IBA program has found. So of course I can't speak for KBA Canada.
Good. Thanks, Sam. Peter, anything else there that
I'm not seeing any. Possible I lost track, but just a note again, contact for Ian and for our other coordinators is available on our website, kbacanada.org. So do feel free to reach out to anybody through there, any of the presenters today. I'm sure everyone would be happy to chat more or answer further questions over email. Thanks for joining today.
Good. Thanks for your help, Peter, and thanks to everybody for attending and your interest and great questions.
Thanks, guys.
Take care.